For 5 years, every time I found a job, it vanished. The first time, the manager called me into his office with a tight smile. "Camille," he said, folding his hands like he was about to pray, "we received a call about you." A woman had claimed I'd stolen money from a previous employer. The second job ended the same way. Then the third. Then the fourth. Eventually I stopped asking what the accusation was. I already knew. My name is Camille Hartley, and the woman making those calls was my own mother. At first I told myself it was a misunderstanding. My parents had always been strict, but ruining my life? That felt impossible. But after the sixth job disappeared overnight, the truth stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling routine. Every Friday, like clockwork, my father would text me. "Come home. Apologize. And maybe we'll stop." Apologize for what, he never said. By the third year, my savings were gone. By the fourth, my friends stopped answering. And by the fifth, I was sleeping in a women's shelter 2 bus stops from the river, clutching a backpack that held everything I still owned. Some nights I wondered if they were right. Maybe I really was the problem. Then one gray Tuesday afternoon, the shelter receptionist called my name. "Camille, there's a letter for you." The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and addressed in careful, old-fashioned handwriting I hadn't seen since I was a child. My grandfather's. But my grandfather had been dead for 6 months. And the date on the letter said it had been written the week before he died. Inside, the first line made my hands start shaking. "Camille, if you're reading this, it means your parents finally did what I feared they would." I sat on the shelter's narrow metal chair, staring at my grandfather's handwriting. For a moment, the noise of the room faded. The humming fluorescent lights, the quiet chatter of women around the folding tables, the distant rattle of a vending machine. All of it blurred behind the single sheet of paper trembling in my hands. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, had always been the quiet one in our family. While my parents spoke in commands and ultimatums, he spoke slowly, carefully, like every word deserved respect. And now his voice was the only one left that didn't feel like a weapon. I kept reading. "I know what your parents are capable of, Camille. I have watched them control people their entire lives. They believe obedience is the same as love." My throat tightened. If they ever turned that control on you, I wanted you to have something they couldn't take away. A second envelope slid from inside the letter. It was smaller. Heavier. Inside was a folded document and a small silver key taped carefully to the corner. I unfolded the paper. It was a bank trust document, notarized and dated 2 months before his death. My eyes scanned the number once, then again. $480,000. The account holder name was written clearly across the top. Camille Hartley. Below it, in my grandfather's careful script, was a final line. "Your parents think survival will force you back to them. They're wrong. Use this to build a life they can't touch." My phone buzzed in my pocket at that exact moment. A message from my father. "Come home. Apologize." I looked down at the silver key taped to the paper. And for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel powerless anymore. I didn't rush to the bank. That was the first lesson my grandfather had taught me when I was little. When you finally hold a winning card, don't slam it on the table. Let the room believe you're still losing. So I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into my backpack. That night at the shelter, I barely slept. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and instant noodles, and somewhere near the window an old heater clicked every few minutes like a tired metronome. For 5 years I had been surviving hour by hour. Now suddenly, I had options. The next morning I walked 3 blocks to a quiet cafe near the bus station. My phone buzzed again before I even sat down. Another message from my father. "Still being stubborn, Camille? You know this ends when you apologize." I stared at the words for a long moment. My parents had spent years carefully dismantling my life. Job by job, reference by reference. Every time I tried to stand on my own feet, another anonymous phone call appeared. A criminal. Untrustworthy. Dangerous to hire. And businesses believed them. But what my parents didn't know was that my grandfather had spent 40 years running a law office in Chicago. And the document in my bag wasn't just money. At the bottom of the trust papers was a second name. Attorney Daniel Whitmore. My grandfather's former partner. Which meant someone out there already knew exactly what my parents had done. I stirred my coffee slowly, thinking. For the first time in years, my father's message didn't sound threatening. It sounded impatient. And impatient people start making mistakes. 2 days later, I stood outside a quiet brick building on Michigan Avenue. The brass sign beside the door read, Whitmore and Caldwell, attorneys at law. My grandfather's name was still there. I hesitated before going inside. The glass door reflected a version of me I barely recognized. Tired eyes, borrowed coat from the shelter donation rack, hair tied back with a cheap elastic band. 5 years ago, I had been applying to marketing firms and planning weekend trips with friends. Now I looked like someone who had been slowly erased. Inside, the office smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. A receptionist looked up. Can I help you? My name is Camille Hartley, I said, sliding the letter across the desk. Arthur Whitmore told me to come here. Something changed in her expression. Within minutes, I was sitting across from a tall man with silver hair and thoughtful eyes. Daniel Whitmore. He studied the letter carefully, then leaned back in his chair. Your grandfather, he said quietly, was worried about you. My throat tightened. He knew my parents were calling my employers? Daniel gave a slow nod. Not just calling. He turned his computer screen toward me and opened a folder. Inside were recorded phone logs, transcripts, and written statements. 5 years of them. My firm began documenting everything after your grandfather asked us to keep watch, Daniel said. Every false accusation. Every company they contacted. I stared at the files in disbelief. You've been collecting evidence this whole time? Daniel folded his hands calmly. Yes. Then he looked directly at me. Because when your parents finally crossed the legal line. He tapped the screen gently. We wanted to be ready. And suddenly I understood. My parents thought they had spent 5 years breaking me. But quietly, patiently. Someone had been building a case. For a long moment I just stared at the screen. 5 years of phone logs. Recorded voicemails. Written statements from former managers who had received the same warning call about me. Every accusation my mother made. Every threat my father repeated. Documented. I felt something strange in my chest, like the first breath after being underwater too long. They said I was a criminal, I whispered. Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly. Yes. Repeatedly. He clicked open one of the audio files. My mother's voice filled the quiet office. Calm. Controlled. Almost polite. I'm only calling because you deserve to know. Camille has a history of stealing from employers. I'd hate for your company to suffer the same mistake we did. My stomach twisted. For years I had wondered if I was imagining the pattern. If maybe the world had simply decided I wasn't worth hiring. But hearing her voice, so confident, so deliberate, removed every doubt. Daniel paused the recording. Your grandfather believed your parents were trying to force you back under their control, he said. Financial dependence is a powerful leash. I thought about the messages my father sent every week. Come home. Apologize. 5 years of pressure. 5 years of humiliation. So what happens now? I asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead he slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a prepared legal document. At the top were 2 words that made my pulse quicken. Defamation lawsuit. Then Daniel looked at me carefully. Camille, the evidence is strong, he said. But filing this case will expose everything. I swallowed. My parents already destroyed my life. Daniel nodded once. Then you should know something else. He tapped another page in the folder. Your mother didn't just call your employers. I looked down and felt my heart drop, because the list of companies was far longer than I expected. The list ran down the page like a quiet confession. 27 companies. Some I remembered applying to. Some I never even heard back from. I hadn't realized were connected at all. Next to each one was the same note. Caller. Linda Hartley, statement recorded. My mother. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the desk, trying to steady myself. She called places I never even worked at, I said softly. Daniel nodded. She called places you might work at. The realization settled slowly like dust in sunlight. My parents hadn't just been ruining jobs I had already secured. They had been quietly poisoning opportunities before I even reached them. Blocking doors I didn't know existed. For 5 years. I looked down at my phone. Another unread message from my father blinked on the screen. Camille, this stubbornness is exhausting. You know the solution. I almost laughed. For the first time the message didn't feel like control. It felt outdated. Daniel, I said carefully, if we file this lawsuit, what actually happens? He leaned back slightly. Your parents will receive formal notice. The court will review the evidence. And if the judge agrees the accusations were false. He paused. They'll be legally responsible for every dollar of damage caused. 5 years of lost income. 5 years of reputational harm. 5 years of emotional distress. The number in my head felt impossible. But what stayed with me wasn't the money. It was something smaller. Quieter. I remembered the shelter bed. The cold metal frame. The nights I lay awake wondering if maybe I deserved everything that had happened. I closed the folder slowly. Then I looked up at Daniel. Let's file it. He gave a small, approving nod. But before he turned back to his computer he said one more thing. Camille, your parents still think you're powerless. I slipped my phone back into my bag. Yes. And for the first time in years. I was curious to see how they would react when they realized they were wrong. 3 weeks after we filed the lawsuit my phone rang. Not a text this time. An actual call. That, for 5 years he had never called. Messages were easier, controlled, one-sided, impossible to argue with. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello. Silence. Then a sharp breath. What did you do, Camille? His voice wasn't calm like before. Sounded thin. Tight. I filed a lawsuit, I said. You're destroying this family. The sentence came out automatically like he'd practiced it in a mirror. I leaned back in the chair of my small rented studio apartment, the first place I had signed a lease for in years. No, I replied quietly. You did that. Another pause. Then my mother's voice appeared in the background. She's bluffing, she whispered loudly enough for me to hear. Camille doesn't have money for lawyers. I almost smiled. Actually, I said, Grandpa made sure I did. The line went completely silent. For the first time in my life, my parents didn't seem prepared. My father cleared his throat. You're overreacting, he said finally. We were only trying to teach you responsibility. 5 years. 5 years of sabotage. Reduced to a lesson. I looked out the window at the late afternoon sun stretching across the city streets. Dad, I said softly, the court hearing is next month. He didn't respond. But before hanging up he said one last thing. You're making a mistake. I ended the call and placed the phone on the table. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was a mistake. Because the more evidence Daniel uncovered, the clearer it became that my parents hadn't just tried to control my life. They had done something far more dangerous. And the judge was about to see all of it. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. I sat beside Daniel Whitmore, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening as the judge reviewed the evidence. Across the room my parents sat together at their table. For the first time in my life, they looked small. Not powerful. Not confident. Just nervous. The recordings were played one by one. My mother's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers, calmly telling employers I was dishonest, dangerous, untrustworthy. 27 calls. 27 lies. At one point my father leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something urgently. I watched the confidence drain from his face the longer the evidence played. Finally, the judge removed his glasses and looked toward their table. What your daughter experienced, he said carefully, was not discipline or parental guidance. He paused. It was a sustained effort to damage her livelihood. The room was completely silent. Weeks later, the ruling became official. My parents were ordered to pay financial damages large enough to cover years of lost income and reputational harm. But the money wasn't the moment that stayed with me. It happened outside the courthouse. As reporters asked questions, my father walked toward me slowly. For 5 years he had demanded one thing from me. Apologize. Now he looked tired. Defeated. Camille, he said quietly, can we talk? I thought about the shelter bed. The empty job inboxes. The weekly messages telling me to crawl back. Then I shook my head gently. You already said everything you wanted to. I stepped past him and into the sunlight. And for the first time in years, the future felt like it actually belonged to me.